So we've been here before with this ministerial handbook and the provisions contained therein. But now, given where the South African public finds itself with load shedding, even water shedding in some instances at this point, you have these amendments to the ministerial handbook that speaks to free, uncapped electricity and water for South African ministers. How did we get here?
Well, this is, as you say, this is a long saga. I remember back when the first ministerial handbook became public knowledge. For many, many years, none of us knew anything about all the perks that the ministers got. And once we found out about a decade ago, I think people were astounded to learn of all the different things that the ministers and deputy ministers received. And so in the context of that backlash, what we found some amendments that happened, and they were pulling back. In other words, putting caps on different things, saying no. It used to be unlimited flights, for example. Everything was more or less unlimited. So there was a little bit of a pullback. But now, after COVID and after all of the things that have happened in the last years, where the flow of information has been fairly minimal, what we found is they've sneaked in once again. They've gone backwards again and sneaked in increases, and you mentioned some of them. I mean, the particular one that I think is galling for a lot of South Africans is this issue of no load shedding, and they're not affected by what everyone else is affected by, and the fact that all the other kinds of perks are fairly outrageous. But this one in particular, I think, hits us in the gut, which is to say, while we're sitting here in the dark, suffering from stage 6, stage 4 power cuts, ministers are basically going about their business as they please. And not only that, but they're getting subsidized to do so. And I think there's that feeling that there is a completely different set of rules, and we don't understand why, particularly given the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, has basically said that he's trying to implement a situation where ministers and others are closer to the people, where they're listening to what people have to say, where they're feeling that pain. And in fact, this is going in the opposite direction. So it's sort of a slap in the face. I think that's what people feel. And it's one has to ask, where did these decisions get taken and why did they get taken? I think that's why we're angry.
And obviously, if you look at the utilities, quite apart from the fact, as you say, that we're all appalled by the fact that ministers are not subject to load shedding like the rest of us, there's this cap that they used to have on the payment of utilities, a 5,000 Rand cap. And now that has been taken out at a time when you and I, pensioners in this country, are subject to exorbitantly high utility rates. Why should they not be subjected to the same?
A very, very good question. And the president needs to answer that question. They cannot keep hiding behind this issue. When the spokesperson, the presidential spokesperson, was asked, he kept saying, well, the cost of living has gone up. It's the cost to run the generators has become massive. The fact is that taxpayers' money is being spent, more taxpayers' money than previously. So it's unfathomable in this kind of context. And let me just to give a picture for listeners and viewers to what other kinds of things. So it's not just the 5,000 Rand cap. What we also have is just to remind people that all the ministers and deputy ministers get free car allowances. In the last few years, they've also gotten new cars. 19 million was spent on brand new cars. They get all their usual free flights. Their children get free flights. They get free house renovations. Their domestic workers are paid for. And all of their out-of-pocket expenses for any trips that have to do with official business are all covered, and they can stay in 5-star accommodation. So when you add all of those things up, the 5,000 Rand seems minimal, but it's part of a package that basically says taxpayers are going to pay for everything that the senior politicians, in this case cabinet ministers, have. And in a time where our basic utilities and our basic services are going through the floor, they're going to basically live in the penthouse, and they're not going to be affected at all. This is classic. This is classic sort of arrogance of power and entitlement. And this is precisely the kind of thing that is going to make people realize, ask the question of where are the interests of these ministers really lying? Do they have any sense of what people are going through? Do they have any kind of empathy and any kind of sense of that? Or are they simply at such a level and living in such a bubble that they can't see what everyone else is doing? And they don't think there's anything wrong with it. That's, I think, also what is really, really angering people is when you ask them and say, wait a minute, don't you feel bad about this? They're like, no, we don't. It's okay for us. And I think that abuse of taxpayers' money for self-interest is really, really outrageous.
And I think, Dr. McKinley, I don't think South Africans are necessarily opposed to ministers enjoying certain perks, but it is the how of it. As you said, at some point we saw an attempt to pull back slightly. I remember Praveen Gordhan, for example, flying economy class. And now you read the ministerial handbook and we're back to business class. Why?
Yeah, there's no explanation for it. Our fiscus is tight. We have been hit hard by COVID. We've been hit hard by a whole range of different things, whether it's the war in Ukraine, the rise in fuel prices, inflation rates, interest rates, you name it. It's across the board. In that kind of context, what the basic expectation of any citizenry of its political leaders is to basically say, we are all in this boat. We all have to suffer. And this was, I think, when it started, if we go back about 10 or 15 years ago, it was when ministers and all the top politicians were given way above inflation-related increases. And then you had Marikana. You had a situation where workers were asking for 12,500 Rand a month, and they were denied that and saying it was unaffordable for that. And that hit a nerve, which was to say that there's such a gap there between the expectation that you have a political office that somehow, and I think this goes to answering some of your question, which is we've got a political class that has become so used to this lifestyle and so used to these perks that they think it's their entitlement. And they're outraged when people sort of question whether or not, as you say, it's not about basic things being covered. Nobody has a problem with that. But when it's this excess in the context of economic pain that is being experienced and joblessness and basic service infrastructure crumbling, that's, I think, where people then say, but you have to have some kind of equity. You have to have some kind of empathy for the ordinary person. And when you don't, you then have a situation where a political culture and those has become to such a degree that it is so outside of any sense of what would be expected of any political class that is representative of their constituents in a democracy. And I think that is where the crucial point lies. It's not just simply about a policy decision of Treasury to increase a certain amount. It's about a political culture that says, if I'm at this level, then this is the kind of lifestyle I'm going to lead.
And this from the same Treasury that expects ordinary South Africans to tighten their non-existent belts. And then, you spoke earlier about how this ministerial handbook was shrouded in secrecy for the longest time. And I remember when it first came to light, we had a very long conversation about this on the radio. But then, here we are again. The handbook was allegedly amended in May. 5 months later, we are now discussing this. Why isn't there, this information flow whereby the public can engage with the proposed amendments before they are actually made law?
Again, Sakina, it's part of a political and governance culture that has become very, very secretive and has blocked off the access to information. As you say, we've talked about this. We have a law, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which gives us the right as citizens to access information that affects our rights, clearly, and whether that's from private or public sectors. But unfortunately, what the practice has been is that when it comes to these kinds of things like the ministerial handbook, the answer will be, no, this is personal, it's confidential information, it's security-related information, whatever the excuse might be. And we see it across the board. So let me give an example that many people might not know about, some people might have heard. But there is a general laws amendment bill that is about to be passed by Parliament that is supposedly going to deal with our threat of gray listing, this financial gray listing that people have read about in terms of access of terrorist-related finance issues and money laundering. In that bill, there is a demand, and for all NPOs, whether you're community, whether you're creche, whether you're whatever, to register and go through a whole bureaucratic process. This could affect hundreds of thousands of civil society organizations, yet nobody knew about it until a week ago. They then gave 10 days for commentary before this bill is passed this week. And so what you have is and it's outrageous. This is something that affects fundamentally millions of potential people and social welfare organizations. And like the ministerial handbook, it affects our rights. And we have the right to know these things. And yet government continuously basically puts barriers up to those information and then tells us that we just must accept this process. It's not acceptable. It fundamentally violates our constitutional and procedural rights. And it's got to stop, because that secrecy goes along with hiding the bad aspects of governance and the bad things. So when we find afterwards, it's much, much more difficult for us then to pull back on that and to basically remove those kinds of barriers. So this is a battle for all South Africans. When we don't have access to information, when we don't know what our politicians are doing, our democracy is in trouble. And we've been saying this for quite some time. And now, once again, with this ministerial handbook, we're reminded why that's the case.
And there's, of course, the saying that you measure a country's leadership success based on how well it takes care of its people, especially the poor. So what sort of message does this free electricity and free water to ministers who get paid very well, what message does that send to already frustrated South Africans?
It sends a message that we don't care. Simple as that. If a minister, I sometimes, if you try to put yourself into a shoe of a minister, let's say, and okay, so you've got a really, really good salary, so you have quite a lot of responsibilities and everything else. But if you're, for example, if we talk about Ubuntu, if we talk about collectiveness, if we talk about be South Africans and so forth, and we help each other, particularly after the COVID. If you live in a community and your neighbors are suffering, the human thing to do, the right thing to do, is to try to help. Well, just think of our country as a larger community. And then you have a class of individuals that have basically set themselves up on the hill in the castle, and they've closed the doors and they pulled down the shutters, and they basically said, we don't want to see how you live. We don't want to know how you live. For us, it's a different world. And when that begins to happen, it reminds us of many times throughout history, when leaders begin to start basically feeling that they have nothing in common with ordinary people, then they're in trouble. So it's not just us that are angry and frustrated at them, but they become in trouble because people will lose trust. They'll basically turn their backs on people, and they'll say, these politicians are going to need to change. And I think that's what you're beginning to see in our political culture, in our electoral results and everything else, is that we're fed up. And if the politicians keep doing these things, they're going to find themselves not only not enjoying 2.5 million rand, they might find themselves without a job.
Well, we'll have to leave it there for this morning, but thanks so much for your time. That was Economic and Political Analyst Dr. Dale McKinley.